And hello and welcome to another of these A Night in the JOL series. And today, of course, we're talking about community music making in Queensland. My name's Kate Evans and I'm from Radio National. And what we're talking about today is the history and practices of community music, how the sounds of people tuning up and perhaps the sound of people stomping their feet in the audience, cheering and whistling, or waiting hopefully for their turn to go on stage in a Stedford or a band comp, how all of these things echo through the archives and the collections elsewhere, but particularly here at the John Oxley Library. Because whether it's a discreet tin whistle in the back pocket or a rather less discreet cello on your back, a set of clapping sticks, a drum or a set of songs for ceremonial purpose, this is a story that helps inform who we are. And tonight we're also springing off from the three exhibitions that make up the wonderful live exhibition here at the State Library, because every object or photo in that exhibition has hundreds of others behind it, whole piles of programs and ripped tickets that have been looked at and for various reasons haven't made it to the exhibition. So with the help of librarians and curators Robin Hableton and Laurel Dingle, who are here and whose expertise we'll be drawing on, we've put together a collection of scrapbooks and stories, photos and, well, melodies really, to look at later tonight. But first let's turn to our musical experts, both from the Queensland Conservatorium, Griffith University. Professor Peter Roennfeldt is a historian and expert in the history of music in Queensland, and Dr. Brydie-Leigh Bartleet is a specialist in community music. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Bridie, this session focuses on community music, but what does that mean?
You'd think it'd be a fairly easy thing to define, wouldn't you? Community music. When I say the words community music, you probably all conjure up some kind of image in your mind about what it might be, whether it's a band you've played in, an orchestra or a choir. But when we start to drill down a little bit further about what it is, it becomes a little bit more complicated. And it's actually something that's been debated a lot, not only in Australia but internationally, about what we mean by community music. We can think about those bands, choirs and orchestras like I've just said, but that's a very kind of, you could say, Western concept of what community music might be. But in the work that I've done, going and working with remote Indigenous communities, you say community music and it means something a little bit different. But there are certain characteristics that we associate with community music: participation, getting involved, being involved in something that connects to local issues, having a really important role in a local community. We've seen great examples of that and the role that bands have played in all sorts of civic ceremonies and things like that. So we know that community music in Australia is really diverse. There's a really wide range of different activities that happen, but probably the single most important thing is that participation element.
So Peter, if we take the longer view and take a historical approach to this, how does our sense of what community music making is that changed, or is it something that you'd see as a sort of static definition? What sort of range of music making are we talking about?
Well, the research I've done has focused mainly on concert music. You would say music performed in formal situations with people buying a ticket, sitting quietly in an audience. But I've also come across in newspaper reportage of people attending social events at which music was played. There were these grand pavilions, Breakfast Creek was one, and where people would go and promenade and there would be music playing, and there were commentaries on what was appropriate to what sort of music might have been heard in those situations. So that's still talking about people. You have your performers and your audience. I've also noticed a trend, particularly in the 19th century, where people would distinguish in the way they presented themselves to the public, also on the printed programs and also in the reviews, this distinction between amateur and professional. And I think we still carry a lot of baggage with those terms today, and which is probably embedded in a lot of the discussion about community music. Can you be a professional community musician, or is it only for the amateurs? And we've also rather changed the meaning of the word amateur over the years by meaning someone who doesn't get paid, where originally it means someone who loves what they're doing. And I'd like to think that community music is about people loving what they do, whether or not they get paid. So I see those trends, and it seemed to be there was this broad-ranging discussion. I've looked at particularly chamber music in the last half of the 19th century, And people felt rather proud that they would hear a string quartet, because that was seen that the whole community was elevating itself and gaining cultural refinement. But at the same time, I know that a lot of people who played in those chamber groups are also playing in the dance halls and providing music in the theatres, so they were very adaptable and flexible musicians. And in the days before there was any funding of the arts, you found your work or made your own work opportunities. And so I think there was a lot of, in a sense, a blurring between what was actually professional work of something you might think was the highest standard of classical music versus something that was music that everybody needed to do and wanted to hear.
Limited funding for the arts, that's obviously a historical thing. It's very hard to imagine now. Just looking at the material here from the John Oxley, one of the types of bands and community music making that struck me was the number of fife and drum bands. Now, I've never heard or seen a fife and drum band, and I wonder where they come from. I mean, because it sounds like it could be a combination of both a military tradition and perhaps an Irish tradition, and there seem to be school-based fife and drum bands.
That was actually interesting. In the later work, Brydie knows all about this. She saw me at the beginning and the end of my 7-year-long project writing the history of the Conservatorium, and you would think I was only looking at that, but actually I found myself needing to find out what was going on around town. And this thing about the bands in the schools was an interesting point. We had a very visionary Director General in the Education Department who was appointed just before the Second World War and retired in 1951. And one of the first things he did, he said he expanded the already existing fife and drum band program in the schools. Then he introduced choirs, and then they had a string quartet that toured a lot. So it must have been there already. I think actually even Patrick Thomas, who was a well-known musician in Queensland's history, he was chief conductor of the Queensland Symphony, before that a flute player. His first musical experience was as one of those five players in his school at Eagle Junction, and he talks about that was his first experience. And I think it's a bit like the way the recorder became in later decades. Basically anyone could have a go and make a sound without too much effort or expertise, and hopefully it was an introduction to musical performance.
I'm curious, has anybody here in the audience been in a fife and drum band?
Well, you tell us.
There you go.
My dad's fife, so he would have been playing that in the mid-1930s.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're keen to hear more of that later, and we'll give you the microphone so we can make sure we get it on tape. But one of the things I guess that references, Brydie, is the ways in which the formats for community music has changed. And do you have much of a sense of that change? I mean, just thinking of schools, I mean, I gather that ukulele groups are expanding now, and maybe they're the new fife and drum band.
Yeah, well, that's true. Any ukulele players here, by the way? Oh, we've got some as well. Like Peter was saying, you know, we were all subjected to the recorder at some stage at school as well, probably because it was a really accessible instrument. My 2-year-old twins can play the recorder quite successfully, to my great distress. But there was something accessible about it, and also you could put groups together and people could play together and form a recorder ensemble. And so I think the ukulele probably serves a similar function in that it's a reasonably accessible instrument. Practically it's small as well, so for young children to play it's easier than picking up a guitar. It's something that's also cheap. My daughter's ukuleles cost $25. Not all instruments are that cheap, and so there's a level of accessibility, and there's also the ability to put people together in groups. And of course we know that the most important thing in community music making is that social side of things. You hear all the stories in the collection, and it's about the friendships and the family connections that are formed. And so when you put people together in those ukulele groups or the recorder groups or even the fife and drums groups, there's that social element as well. These instruments go well together. So all of these different formats kind of allow for that.
And of course, particularly in Queensland, there is that connection to Pacific Island communities and traditions. And I know ukuleles are huge in New Zealand as well.
That's right.
But I wasn't being entirely facetious when I mentioned the military connections to fife and drums. And there are so many different traditions that have had an influence on community music. Peter, where does that military tradition fit in? Where does that come through in the story?
Well, I think you'll find back in the references, the earliest musicians that arrived in Australia with European settlers were the military musicians. They were the people who came. There wouldn't have been many free settlers who came thinking, I'll set out and start a musical career in the colony of New South Wales. I don't think anybody migrated with that, thought it might until much later. So the fact that the military, well, it comes from that whole tradition of signals, you know, in battle. Certain signals mean different things in different stages of the battle. And also marching, music associated with movement and ceremony, and also, I guess, celebration. I mean, and also the type of instruments they are, because brass instruments are good outdoor instruments, and bands and groups have to move around in the outdoors. You can't have string groups forming that same function. It doesn't work as well acoustically or physically, but you can march and walk and hold a brass instrument. And so it comes from that tradition, which goes through many cultures, centuries back. But in Australia's case, because we were a penal colony, you had the official staff of that colony were the people in charge, you know, on a legalistic level, and they had governors, and so they needed their ceremony, and with that came the military bands. And also in you remember in the 19th century there was that already existing, but then the whole movement in the industrial age of the coal miners and the factories and all of those community bands formed out of employees of a big organisation, for the reason giving themselves a sense of belonging together. They weren't just workers, they were also meeting with each other socially. And so many of those bands go back centuries now, and that tradition also came to Australia.
Well, that's a huge part of the story, isn't it? And Brydie, I know that you've done a lot of research into community music making across Australia. What are people telling you about both who they're joining together with and what it means to them?
I think any community musician would say that it's partly about the music. The music's a really important part and performing to the highest levels, but the other part is that social aspect, as well as in many cases a cultural aspect, as well as a political aspect, as well as a connection to where they live aspect. So there's this whole other realm that comes with why people join a community group. They don't just go there to not talk to anybody, to sit and play and leave at the end of the night without having a good cup of tea and a good yarn with the people that they're playing with. So there's that aspect that's really important, and I think that's a major motivation for why people play. And we were looking at the digital story in the collection there, where some people said, I've been playing for 20 years. Now, why does that person keep going back? It's for something more than simply just to play the music and ignore everybody else around. So I think that's, although some people do, I know, that's a major motivating force. And I think community music serves a number of functions, and I think we've kind of downplayed those or almost overlooked those and not really acknowledged well enough all of those other roles that community music actually plays, because it's so busy playing a function in a local community that the rest of the country doesn't actually get to see the tremendous work that's been happening. So that's what our research has really tried to do, is to try and lift those stories up and let people know about them.
And I know that that's actually an important part of the collecting practices of the John Oxley, and I gather one of the very latest acquisitions, part of which is sitting over there on the table, is a set of scrapbooks from a man who was just interviewed. So his oral history experience was collected. He was 77. He'd been playing in bands, since he was a teenager, and so it's not just the memory and the experience, but also the material that he kept. So you've got the music making and his life history, and they're intertwined, and that might be something that we can talk more about, later, particularly informally, or it might be something that you want to contribute. Music can be dangerous. It can be a rallying call. It can be something that people sing or play before they storm the barricades. Singing a rebel song in an Ulster pub can get you in a lot of trouble. So music can join all sorts of groups together. And it's not just a, warm, fuzzy, soft thing, is it? So when you look at the history of music making in Queensland, how political is it? Is that something that you've examined?
Not myself, but I'm aware that other researchers have done, and some that you see in the level 2 display, which is really interesting. It puts the music alongside the political developments last 50 years, and in a very clever way of linking songs of the time that somehow sum up the mood of the time. that go with a certain political movement or cause. I think over this, I'm looking back slightly longer again. I don't know that, actually, I can cite one interesting example, which actually came from one of my first forays into this area with the State Library. We had been approached by our colleagues here to record performances of some of the popular sheet music that was in the collection already but didn't have recordings. So the scores were being digitised, and then we provided recordings to go with some of those. And of course, by looking at each of the pieces, we recorded about 20. We wanted to find a bit more about the piece, who performed it first, and the circumstances. And I see some of the people here who helped you've helped me with the research. And the one that I keep using as an example of really summing up one piece of music can be this rallying cry. Billy Hughes, Prime Minister, came to Brisbane in 1916, I think it was. June 17, yeah. Gave a speech at the exhibition hall. Thousands of people came. They were waiting outside for some time. And then when they all got into the hall, which could seat a couple of thousand people, to entertain them before the Prime Minister came, various musical items were performed. And so the song we recorded was a more solemn song about the personal side of going to war. But it's reported in this extensive report, and Mr. So-and-so played variations on Rule Britannia, and the audience joined in the choruses might lustily, and so you can just imagine this, hearing Rule Britannia in that very fraught campaign for conscription in 1917. It would have been divisive, but it also would have been a rallying cry. Now, something like Rule Britannia we think is a sort of last night at the prom sort of tune today, but actually then, I think for those in the First World War, I think the attitude that Australians had to the First World War as a real national honour to be involved. Hearing Rule Britannia, it was a euphonium soloist, what's more, a euphonium soloist, variations on Rule Britannia, and the chorus sang might lustily along. So, but I don't want to trivialise it too much, but I can show it does actually have that response in people. Now that would have been a crowded hall, 2,000 people, and they all joined in, this poor euphonium soloist on the choruses, because they were stirred with emotion.
One of the things I'm curious about, though, is which versions of these songs end up in the archive, because I know there's been some. I'm pretty sure there were some extremely rude songs about Billy Hughes as well. And some of them, I mean, like there's that famous ballad, The Bastard of the Bush. And I've only once come across the full unexpurgated version of that, and honestly, I could not repeat it in the room. Yeah. It's extraordinarily explicit. And so... And a lot of this is live. There are union songs, there are... Yeah. Well, and in fact, one of the songs I saw in a program over there, and it was in a very polite program, they had a sea shanty, and it was The Fire in the Hold. Now, I've heard a discussion of that song as a song about sexually transmitted diseases, and that's what The Fire in the Hold was. And I don't think that was quite how it was being performed, just reading the rest of the... So how do you access that live experience and the way in which music is experienced in front of us on paper? How do you access that part of the story?
It's really interesting. I mean, sometimes you come across these old remastered recordings of people singing these dance hall songs, and you can just imagine by their mannerisms how they might have been acting it out as well. Just drawing a quick reference to, once again, that collection that's in the Music Queensland collection, there's a song, there was a big trend in the 1910s and 20s and even the 30s of place name songs. I believe there's about 200 written around Australia. The one we know most commonly is The Road to Gundagai, but there, any place worth its salt had a song written about it. And I played the Sandgate song to some friends of mine who lived at Sandgate, and I thought, oh, they live there, they'd like to hear about it, and one of them is a historian who was involved with the local historical society. And they found something in the text that I never would have thought, but then you think back, it's pretty obvious. In the chorus it says about the girls at Sandgate are very sweet, introductions are not required when you meet down at Sandgate by the sea. Now that's rather risque too. Because you see those pictures of people going to Sandgate for the big day out on the train to Sandgate, promenading by the beach. It's a big, big social event. But the other side, Sandgate's a bit risque as well. So digging that, now that's social referencing. I guess that's in a way semiotics of the whole composition of the piece, what's below the text. And music they often say about Mozart's operas, you learn more about what he's saying through the music than through the words the singers are singing. So I think music has that subliminal quality to get into meaning in a different way. It bypasses the cognitive side of your senses sometimes and goes straight to a lower level, and sometimes what's in the music can actually be the real meaning.
So, but Bridie, what else gives you access to that experience of being in the audience? I mean, what about ephemera or tickets that are torn in half, or the T-shirts that people bought that said, you know, I'm with the drummer? What does... or not.
There's a drummer over there. You can tell by the wicked laugh. I mean, we can conjure up our own images and come up with our own ideas of what those sorts of experiences must have been like. I was just downstairs and saw the dance cards, and I hadn't seen these before, and I just already started to come up with this wonderful vision in my mind of what it would have been like to try and get names on your dance card right up to number 13 and the waltz at the end, which was obviously the prime place. And that little piece of paper and those little names that had been scribbled on immediately came to life for me, and I could have stared at that for ages and just imagined what that must have been like. Likewise, the digital story that they made downstairs with musicians from 4 of Brisbane's great bands, I had a real lump in my throat listening to everybody's stories and hearing about what music means to them and why they keep playing, and goosebumps as I was hearing each of the groups perform and rehearse. So that video capture and in that digital kind of format, and also hearing people speak it, you just watch their faces and they come to life, and all of a sudden there's this injection of energy in them. And so capturing that on film like we have here is a really wonderful way of bringing it to life for everybody. So there are many, many different ways, and I think they've done an amazing job with this particular exhibition. It really has brought it to life for people in a way that I don't think they quite might have imagined.
But Peter, you were saying that newspaper records that are surprisingly detailed also give you access to, it helps you imagine being in the room. So what is it that you're reading that takes you there?
I think you can get the facts. I mean, I go to Trove constantly for my research because you get the reportage, you get what happened when. You get the classified advertisements, which actually give you the details of what's coming up, and often how in the days before any sort of special formatting, the way they presented themselves to sell more tickets. But the reportage is interesting because there's the social columns as well as the arts columns as well as the other sorts going. They're the main ones I would go to. I'd be looking for things like comments on how the audience responded, because you have little cues quite often, say, and the audience, and calling for an encore back then, I'm thinking pre-First World War, was a very significant compliment to the performers. And I think it's a practice we've sort of lost touch with a bit. It was a real sign of honour that this audience really appreciated what was being performed. So evidence of things like that. The comments on the whether what was being presented was something new or different or special in some way. I've seen references to how people felt, well, it's good to see that we have so many cultured people now who will come to a performance like this and appreciate it. So there's like a social barometer in a way, testing where the community is at. Will this venture survive because of the way the audience is accepting it? There was a family string quartet, the Jeffries family, and they performed for many years, and even when their father retired and died, the daughters kept it going. And there's a reference they played at the Albert Street Church, and the Jeffries quartet was greeted most heartily on arriving on stage. Now you just know this group had a following, yet the other group that was performing not as successfully, the commentary was, well, it's difficult to, perhaps we've not yet arrived at the time when midweek concerts would be successful, but we were hoping that the leisured class might think in that direction. You know, so you know, sort of, there's a lot of, you know, you can read a lot into that, like what sort of music was seen to be appropriate for which parts of the community, who's likely to support this or not. And I referred earlier to those exhibition halls where people were prominent. Oh, there was a hysterical comment. the Breakfast Creek Pavilion, which opened in the early 1890s, was a great, and they'd have classical nights and opera nights and popular nights and ballad nights. That, every night of the week there'd be something going on. Thousands would come, and one comment was, these events are becoming so popular that it may become necessary to reduce the amount of space given to promenading. We might have to put out more seats. So, so you just tell, this was the big night out. But music is always there. I think that's what we musicians are kind of will keep saying. We are friends with our other art forms, performing arts and visual arts, but you think about most social occasions, there'll always be music where they may not be the other art forms, but there'll always be some form of music. And it's an underpinning of whatever's going on. So when I read in those comments, I pick out these little sort of comments, and it just immediately brings an image to you but it's about reception and response. I think that's mainly that. You can't tell a lot about someone's skill unless it's very detailed. You'd get what they performed, more or less how they did it, but in the absence of recordings, you're guessing on that level.
And of course, you don't actually have to go to Trove or back to the original newspapers to find this, because a lot of the performers kept detailed scrapbooks.
Yes, yeah.
And there are some extraordinary examples over here. And one is from a man whose name was England, who was a singer. He was a civil servant. Yeah. Is that right? So he had a full-time job. And when you look at the way in which he documented what he did, and very much as an amateur performer, every second night of the week he was out performing, and he kept the clippings and he kept track of it. And he didn't always say the date or where he clipped it from, which is sort of frustrating when you're a researcher. But it says so many things about, again, both a life, but also a music within a life, which is my segue back to you, Brydie, because you are a band leader, aren't you? So what does that mean to you?
I have been in the past. I haven't got time right now with little ones to be doing it, but I have in the past, and I was pleased to see one of the jackets from the Brisbane Symphonic Band, which I used to lead. It was a tremendous experience conducting them. They were very brave to go with the young female conductor and put me in front of them. Many of them have been playing for 40 years, longer than I'd been alive, but they gave me a go, and it was the most tremendous experience. I remember my first gig with them, we had an audience of about 7. But when I left, we had actually toured internationally to audiences of 4,000 plus in Asia, and had the most tremendous time together as a group.
What sort of group? What sort of band?
It was a wind band. Yeah, a wind band. And so it's been going for quite a few decades now, but it's one of the newer bands in terms of Brisbane's community bands. But if I think back to some of the musicians who I worked with in that group, I'll probably either get tearful or just have a very wicked smile on my face. Some of them I actually recognise playing in other groups downstairs. Some of them are no longer with us, and I've attended their funerals, and of course those have been attended by hundreds of other musicians, all in their uniform, wanting to play and contribute. And it really is testament to a life that these people have led through music in their local communities. And so for me, what I remember most and cherish most dearly is the musical highlights. Yes, I'm a performer, I love to get up and perform, but it's actually the people who I worked with that really, really left a very big mark on my heart.
But the bands that make a particular noise in this collection are the brass bands. And the collections related to them that are here are enormous. There are posters that seem to show that there's an event or a competition every weekend, as far as I can tell, all across Queensland. But there are also some wonderful photos there that show brass bands all across the country on Palm Island, in Aboriginal reserves. There are Salvation Army bands. What is it about the brass band that is so enduring? Either of you, really?
It's a good question.
I must claim in my family, more in the Barossa Valley, one of my not too distant relatives was a leader of the Marinanga Brass Band, who were one of these competition-winning, really top bands. And I could never get it. I'd heard about this through my family, and now I've gotten to know them a little bit more in recent years of doing more family history. And I've read the history of that band, the Marinanga Brass Band. Now, they came out of the Lutheran German community, so they would have played a lot of church events, so they all went to the same churches. They would have been playing in the communities, and I think the brass band, it's sort of a yes, it can be military and very bright and sharp and march-like, but there's also this other wonderfully mellow, blended sound. When you talk to brass players, and we see them around the building the whole time, they are the most collegial types of musicians. They are always together, drinking
in
and
the pub.
singing, and many of them play multiple instruments. I think the skills involved in brass playing are more transferable around the family of instruments, whereas if you're a flute player, you can't necessarily play the clarinet as well and so on. But I find many brass players, they share themselves around. That's the tradition often. You'd fill in whatever was needed.
Because I just think it's hot. They've got metal instruments. They're standing in the sun. It's Queensland. And yet there seems to be an awful lot of them. And they don't all faint in the heat.
Hot. I thought you meant sexy hot. I thought, oh yeah, there's nothing.
I can see there are musician jokes everywhere.
But I think it's the fact that it's a very malleable ensemble that can play both that bright, sharp, march-like music as well as the most mellow, beautifully blended sounds. And if you go, I had the experience to go to one of the Brisbane Excelsior Band concerts a few years ago. And it was a big night at City Hall, and you know, the sounds coming out of a really top brass band, it's just thrilling. And the dexterity, the technical skills. So I think for a musician, a community musician who's very good at what they do, or for someone who's just sort of more basic, there's a place for them in a brass band. It can take a range of skills. I mean, the best brass bands are as good as any orchestra you'll hear. I mean, the skill and the precision and the detail in their work. And but I think it can be a sit down as well as a mobile ensemble as well. It's this what's the word? Flexibility or
well, and the inclusivity as well, because one of the things that I noticed just looking at the photos of the Salvation Army bands in particular, there's a lot of women sitting there with these enormous brass instruments, and there are more women in the Salvation Army bands than there are in anything else, until you're getting into the dance band period, when there are often, in these pictures here at least, women playing the piano.
And also in terms of accessibility, I played in brass bands for a number of years as well, and those brass bands always owned their own instruments and loaned those out to members. So that's an immediate way of being able to lure members in and to offer them an instrument where people might not normally be able to afford to buy one of those.
And also something that comes across in that little 10-minute video that was done up for the display here. I see some of our former students in there. But what I think about, it's part of this being in a group thing, the collegiality. There's a real mentoring culture in brass bands. You get the senior players taking under the wing the younger players. And I know that also happens in the Salvation Army bands. It's a sense of progressing through the ranks. And one day you might be a lead trumpet, you know, all that sort of thing. But it's a very supportive environment. And I think, and also too, on some sorts of brass instruments, it doesn't take such a long time before you can make a decent sound. Whereas some of the wind instruments, you're working like an oboe. You know, you've got several years before someone will ask you to play for them. But with the brass instruments, it's you get to a level that you can, at least on simple parts, you can join in ensembles much earlier in your development. So,
I recently was lucky enough to have quite a long conversation with Jonathan Weiss, the singer and choir leader, because he's made another documentary that hasn't yet gone to air about what happened next to the Choir of Hard Knocks, which is now called the Choir of Hope and something else. And he was also talking about the huge range of community choirs that are based around all sorts of causes and politics and so on. But he also has a really strong belief in the actual craft of and discipline of music as something that adds things to people's lives. And I guess that's particularly with the homeless people who he works with every week, that this is a sort of constancy and discipline that they don't get anywhere else. Can you talk, I mean, I know the focus has been on bands, but community choirs seem to be particularly good at that inclusivity. Is that something else that you've looked at?
Absolutely. In the research that we've done around the country, we've met an amazing number of different choirs, as you say, who rally around any number of different causes. There's also something about singing. I mean, there are probably singers here who'll know that the physical, Peter's a choral director as well, there's something in the physicality of actually singing and also giving voice. So a lot of the groups that Jonathan Weiss has worked with haven't traditionally, or haven't for any number of social or other reasons, been given voice before. And here they're getting to stand up in front of audience audiences and sing, and their voices not only heard but it's applauded and it's welcomed. And so there's something really, really special about that process of giving voice and then blending your voice with others. You know, when you sing in harmony with somebody else, there's something that just resonates through you and releases all sorts of hormones and is something that makes you feel good. So it's not only the discipline side of things and the relationship side of things, but there's that physicality of singing. You get that in brass playing as well, but there's something very special about being in a choir.
Have you looked at the history of choral music and choirs?
Well, that's really part of my background as well. I spent my formative years in Ipswich, and there was a very strong choral scene. There still is today, and I mean, on a bit like in the band world, there is this competitive nature, winning that A-grade competition at the State of Stedford or whatever. There's that element to it. It's a bit of the civic pride and the team spirit that builds up. They're the more traditional choirs that every medium-sized community and above will have a group like that. But then there are also, choirs also, you'll find them in churches, and they have a very important role there as well. You'll find them in schools. Most schools, if they didn't have their fife and drum band, they would have a choir. And even today, school choirs will be a bare minimum. If you can't afford the instruments, at least you can form a choir. So I guess it's the once again the accessibility. You don't need to buy an instrument; you are the instrument. And also, whereas playing most musical instruments requires some form of musical literacy, singing doesn't necessarily. Although I've spoken to many long-term choral singers who've been in choirs all their lives, they say, the only musical education I ever got was by singing in choirs, because you pick things up and you learn things about reading and you learn things about composers and styles and so on. So there's that self-education that goes along with it. But I think with the choral movement, and it has diversified greatly. Only last year, was it 2012? Yes, it was. I stepped down as the national president of the Australian National Choral Association, and I got to know a bit more about what the scene is like around the country. And I think there's a slight tension around the scene at the moment about what justifies a choir in terms of how you compare one with another, and there will be this comparative thing inevitably. As you get more of one thing, you'll start to see trends and whatever.
Again, politics in music. I'm shocked.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is a very large movement, which is in some parts of Australia now, particularly in the gospel singing area, where once again everybody joins in, everybody has a great time, and we have to come to a view on whether there's just as much learning, just as much artistry, just as much self-expression and discipline and so on in those sorts of groups as the ones who sing from notated music, where there's another level of discipline, if you like. I mean, I'm not someone who thinks all musicians to be any good must be someone who can read music, because music has many aspects to the skill base, not just the literacy. But I think in the choir world, it has diversified enormously. And just looking through the list of members, also knowing the members, people who weren't members, through the list we had about 900, I think, they come from all parts of the community, whether they're set up with a more traditional organisation, a church or a school, or some sort of cultural group, or whether it's a cause-focused group that has some other agenda as well, or whether it's a group that sings a certain sort of repertoire. And then you get the groups who are really aiming for the ultimate in terms of prestige and external accolades through recordings and touring and that sort of thing. So it's a very diverse field, but it's also very inclusive and very, I guess, what's the word? Community, if that's too much of a cliche. I mean, I think every choir has to have a sense of community, even if it's not formed out of community. It has to build its own community, otherwise you can't perform well on stage.
But what that inclusivity means can be quite complicated, can't it? I mean, we were talking about ethnically based musical groups as well, which is something that I know that the library would like to collect more of. But that can mean drawing people together, can also mean stopping people from joining. Whether it's you have to be a member of the union to be in the union choir, or you have to be able to sing in Greek in the Greek choir, or whatever. But if we just Well, actually, we talked about that the other day, so that's something that you've looked at.
Absolutely. I mean, we always talk about community music being very inclusive and everybody can join no matter what your ability. There's sort of always that spirit of openness. But when you dig a little bit deeper, particularly when we've looked at, as I was saying, migrant communities and how groups are formed around those, you can also see a great exclusivity. So with that inclusivity comes this exclusivity, and so I don't think it's a bad thing, but it's just an interesting thing for us to think about when we sort of drill a little bit deeper into how these different groups operate. So thinking about the choirs, if I go down to New South Wales, if it's okay, with an example from Western Sydney, we met an amazing refugee women's choir who came together. Now they wanted to be together because they had shared social and cultural experiences that nobody else could understand, and they could talk in a way with one another and relate to one another and sing a repertoire that they all felt comfortable with and felt connected to. And so there was great exclusivity about that, but then they were very inclusive within that particular cultural group. And so it was really interesting to see the way that operated for the great benefit of those members. They were an amazing choir, but then of course they went to a number of festivals and community events and then shared with the broader community in a wonderful way and shared repertoire and culture and really opened up to people in their broader community as well. So it's kind of really interesting to see that dual way of how community groups can sometimes operate.
There's so many ways in which we can talk about this subject, and I'm actually keen to hear your contribution to it. But before we do turn to the audience, there's something that I saw in the collection here that I'd be curious to get your comments on. So the box is called Music Concert Program Brisbane 1900 to 1925, and in it there's chamber music and school concerts, there's recitals of Neapolitan folk songs, programs from the Brisbane Musical Union. And then on the back of one program from 1924, I saw this. It was an ad for the new Edison Diamond Disc phonograph, and it says, "The instrument that is human." And then they say, through its marvellous realism, bringing to actual life the subtle personalities of the artist, this phonograph fully meets every desire of all exacting music lovers. So, looking at this history, did the mechanical reproduction of music change everything or just give us a new way to do community music?
This is an interesting thing I found. Even in the 60s, people were commenting on the fact that for the mere, owning a machine, pressing a button, you could have music, and this was not a good thing. And, there are whole books being written. I own about 5 or 6 of them, and there are many more that continue to be written about how recording changed music. Certainly accessibility and exposure, dissemination. But also I think, if there is a negative thing in the recording side of music, it's that we, when we go to concerts, we kind of expect the same thing we get on our recordings at home. Perfect, not a blemish. What you get in a live performance is the whole ambience, the feeling of the venue, the space, the size, the people next to you who annoy you with their wrappers on their lollies, and you get the whole package. And for some people, because they have this wonderful sound system at home with their perfect recordings, they find a real dissonance when they come to the live experience, because all that perfection is gone. There's these blemishes in the experience, but actually that's what makes it a real lived experience, because you'll never get a totally pristine live musical performance. There'll be something there. It's a whole package of experiences. So I think the live thing, and you see many of the organisations, you see the logos, they come up and they go, the slogans, keep music live. We've seen that used many times over recent decades, because there is this fear that if you can package it and box it, then the live musician will lose out. But in fact, and actually I read a thing in the paper the other day, and it's some of our colleagues at the Conservatorium mentioned, the whole business model has been turned upside down. People will readily give away their CDs to get people to know their group. It was in an article in The Australian just last week, a young group did it, so that they build up a following, so that when they do tour, they've got a ready-made audience. So in fact, in the olden times, even not so much before the Second World War, say 50s, 60s, when recordings became more mass market, people would get the recordings because someone's famous. Now, you give away or you disseminate recordings to become famous, then you build a life. It's sort of the reverse.
And then there are things like those virtual choirs and orchestras where people are coming together all around the world and creating communities in a different way, aren't they?
That's right, exactly. Some amazing examples. And also people just sharing their performances online on YouTube as well and getting a following that way too. So I was going to mention that flipped model as well. But I don't think recording has stopped any musicians making music. Look at all the examples here you can see. And in my experience, it's also enhanced it. So when I've worked with orchestras and swing bands and whatever, the musicians are listening to the repertoire that they're playing at home and getting really excited about it and then coming to rehearsals and playing it, and it's in fact really enhanced the experience rather than stopping them from playing it because they've got a perfect recording at home to listen to.
But for me, it was also a reminder of the pleasure of research, that you can be looking at one thing and then be distracted by something else and learn something by the ads. And I was actually going to read the lyrics of a particularly dreadful patriotic song that's over there on the table, but I actually won't put you through it because it's awful, except that it reminds us that things like, say, the history of World War One, you could also tell as through the story of music and fundraising concerts and rallying cries and all sorts of things. But it is a particularly ghastly, it's called the Call to Arms for Australia. That's right over there if you're interested. But now it's time to hear from you, whether you'd like to ask a question or tell a story or tell us more about what it was like to be in a fife and drum band. And we do have a radio mic, which would be useful because this is recorded and ends up on the State Library website.